the ANC's intellectual position as hashtag, what would you say, intellectual sludge. But that's part of it. And I think what you've said is very possible. And I say this for the reason that whatever anybody's view on another grouping is, whatever hatreds you may feel or not, that event on the 8th of October, the first reaction should have been your humanitarianism.
The African National Congress has taken a clear stance on the escalating tensions, violence, and attacks perpetrated by Hamas in Israel on the 7th of October. To drill down a bit into the ANC stance itself, we're not going to discuss what occurred and what is continuing now and could possibly escalate at the time of recording on the 20th of October. Joining me to discuss is Sara Gon from the Institute of Race Relations. Sara, thank you very much for your time at the CRA this week. Just to start off with a bit of contest, today on the 20th, you've got a march by the ANC to the Israeli embassy in Pretoria, a focus on Palestinians and Palestinian rights, to sort of quote the language that is being used. But I thought it might be useful just to discuss some of the history, the context around the ANC stance. We didn't see a march on the 8th of October following what happened on the 7th of October, just as one point. And then also you had reports that Minister Naledi Pandor returned a phone call from a leader of Hamas to discuss, in what has now been reported by DIRCO, a day after the call apparently happened, humanitarian aid. So that's just trying to set the scene a bit. A lot of different moving parts. Things are quite complicated. But I thought let's just start with how you see the ANC stance at the moment, and I'm guessing it doesn't really come as a surprise.
It doesn't come as a surprise. It does come with a sense of real sadness, because, you know, there are levels of horror that do require you to put aside your particular allyship with a group, and this was one of them. I mean, they discovered, I think yesterday, they found more bodies, and what they have also discovered yesterday was the bodies of two hostages, a teenage girl and her mother, her grandmother, and apparently the girl was autistic, so they probably couldn't handle her. So there are more deaths in line. I think you've got to understand that, you know, once the ANC went into exile, the power of the South African Communist Party over the ANC sort of, they sort of essentially, let's say, took it over ideologically. And the ANC, the SSCP was very much, is one of the oldest communist parties in the world. And, you know, it was not one of the branches of the Communist Party worldwide that de-Stalinized after his crimes became apparent. And so for the Soviet Union, the ANC with the SSCP was a perfect vehicle for its aims in the Cold War. So you've got the Cold War going on. The West has taken pretty much, is, I don't know, supporting, but is not, destroying the apartheid state. So basically what the Soviet Union did was it took groupings all over the world who were anti-West or anti the establishment of their countries, and turn them into supporters. Now, the Soviet Union's propaganda arm is probably the finest in history. I mean, I do mean the finest in history. They had and one of our columnists has talked about it. Now, interestingly, the Soviet Union supported the formation of Israel in the UN, but as soon as Israel started to move into the Western orbit, so to speak, it turned on them. Now, that in itself is not terribly surprising, because Russian history, Soviet history is replete with anti-Semitism. And it was them that did not invent, but basically literally popularized the term Israel as an apartheid state. And ultimately, through the support from the Third World, they passed the resolution in the UN to say that Zionism is racism, which was quite clever, because the US had proposed a resolution against racism before that, and the only way for the for the Soviet Union to get out from under accusations of anti-Semitism was to get the jump, which is essentially what they did. So the ANC has always been under that. It's part of, it goes with its philosophy, that dates back to the 1950s and 60s. And it's part of the ideology that we see that is destroying this country. In other words, it's an ideology fossilized in a certain era. There's also an element to that, and that is that Simon Conte Wesizwe trained with the PLO in, I think it was Libya, under either the East Germans or the Soviet Union. So the Palestine Liberation Organization is its sort of it's an ally in the cause, if I can put it that way, and that probably sort of explains the history. So once the Mandela era was over, the clear articulated support of the ANC became so it's predominantly a leftist position, and it's a leftist position because it supports other left-wing groupings, and the PLO is a left-wing grouping. It was established by the Soviet Union in 1964. It's also, I mean, there's and the anti-Semitism that is built with it. It's not. I don't think it's naturally sort of a natural instinct of the ANC per se. It's all part of that history.
And Sara, just a question around sort of perception. So if one wants to play devil's advocate fairly or unfairly, you've got the rhetoric of human rights, protection of civilians and children coming out in the past week or two from the ANC, from representatives of the ANC, Palestinian civilians, children, given now that Israel has retaliated after the 7th of October and could in all likelihood launch some kind of ground operation to try and root out Hamas and their operations in the Gaza Strip. So you've got the rhetoric of that sort of thing, but you don't then have the condemnation necessarily that follows that. But now you've got a march to the Israeli embassy. We've had this in the last year or so with South Africa's stance on the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where you've got the rhetoric again of the global South, global solidarity, human rights, but then that's not followed by actions. Indeed, the actions possibly go the other way. In the Russian case, where you've had the allegations around supplying arms and munitions, you had the presidential investigation that comes with its own shortcomings and flaws. But just this bit of a disconnect, do you think that just flows naturally from trying to maintain that historical stance, but not then being able to deal with the moment and who has actually infringed upon rights and acted against other people?
Yeah, well, I think it's probably deeper than that, in the sense that in the wake of the disintegration of the Islamic Golden Age and then the Ottoman Empire, and then with the simultaneous rise of elements like Wahhabism, very, very intensely literal Muslim interpretation, and it's very much the creed in Saudi Arabia. What happened is that essentially, by the time the War of Independence occurred in 1948, when Israel was established and the Arab armies attacked it to destroy it because it didn't want it, you had a percolation of the worst of European anti-Semitism into Arab nationalism. And with that came the creation of what I think is our biggest danger, and certainly to us, and that is the cult of victimhood. So, and as soon as you've got a powerful force like the Palestinian leadership, the Arab world leadership, propagating a propaganda of victimhood, it just had a receptive audience, because it's a sort of shame thing. And then of course you have the disconnect where you've got the victimhood, and you're in a culture that allows, where part of it's not just Hamas, it's every Palestinian grouping. They all want the cessation of Israel, and there is also the religious element of martyrdom. In other words, there's glory in death. So that's why you'll see children as suicide bombers. Now, the Israeli society is the antithesis of that. And it's also, once it gave up socialism, because it was a poor third world developing country, but in the late 70s, once it gave up socialism, it's now, it's now one of the most successful countries in the world, despite having to maintain an army and deal with terrorism, pretty much uninterruptedly. So I think you've got the combination of victimhood, aspects of religion, envy of success. It's a whole mishmash of things that pulls them, and as it's not just the ANC. You've seen it in the demonstrations worldwide. It's what forms the substrate of the success of the Palestinian cause.
Sara, just a final question around possible implications for South Africa as a whole going forward. Should this sort of stance, actions and rhetoric continue, if at the very least there was some kind of consistency? So again, drawing the comparison with the Russian invasion, South Africa professed non-alignment but didn't practice active non-alignment. So if you're actually going to be concerned about human rights, then condemn what Hamas did, and then also say Israel fully within its rights to retaliate, try and do its best within reason, given it's an urban environment. That sort of, at least then walk the talk and walk the talk and talk the walk, maybe, to try and cover all your bases, as it were. But just should this sort of trend continue, do you think South Africa once more risks increasing the possibility that its ties with other countries like the US, the UK, Germany, etc., will become colder? You've got less investment, less prospects for economic growth. Should that sort of thing continue?
We jokingly on one of the podcasts referred to the ANC's intellectual position as hashtag, what would you say, intellectual sludge. But that's part of it. And I think what you've said is very possible. And I say this for the reason that whatever anybody's view on another grouping is, whatever hatreds you may feel or not, that event on the 8th of October, the first reaction should have been your humanitarianism, and it wasn't there. So that's gone. So that's passed. And then you make it very clear. I mean, interestingly enough, the ANC was still condemning Israel for the rocket attack on the hospital in Gaza, which we now know from footage by Al Jazeera, no less, that it was I think it was a Palestinian Islamic Jihad rocket that blew up and then crashed. And I think the Western world is going to have a problem with that, because you also have that unbelievably appalling position of hostages, over 200 hostages. Many of them come from countries other than Israel, not just Europe, not just America, Asia, etc. So it's very broad. You've also got, I think there were 36, no, I'm not entirely sure, but both France and, let's put it this way, France, Germany, Britain and America suffered the death of hostages. And the ANC hasn't even condemned that. I think that's going to be a problem for the ANC. I think there may well be a say of, you've got the AGOA conference coming up next month. It'll be very interesting to see if we're still hosting it by this time next month.
Thank you very much for watching. If you haven't yet, we invite you to like this video before you leave. We also invite you to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Until next time, this has been Chris Hattingh for the Center for Risk Analysis. Take care.